Good morning, colleagues. The first briefing we have today is dedicated to the formation of the High Anti-Corruption Court of Ukraine, and it's the speaker, Mr. Wolf, the chief federal judge in the United States, who heads the Integrity Initiatives International Organization, and Mr. Yegor Sobolev, a prominent Ukrainian fighter against corruption and also a prominent civic activist.
As I think you've just heard in Ukrainian, I am a United States District Judge, a federal trial judge in Boston, Massachusetts, and the chairman of Integrity Initiatives International. Integrity Initiatives International is an NGO started several years ago by colleagues including Justice Richard Goldstone of South Africa, the first prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and I. Our mission is to strengthen the enforcement of criminal laws against corrupt leaders. Initially, our focus, and still a main purpose of III, as we call it, is to catalyze a campaign and ultimately the creation of an international anti-corruption court, similar to, but separate from the existing International Criminal Court. An international anti-corruption court is needed because almost every country in the world has the laws required by the UN Convention Against Corruption. It's illegal in every country, including Ukraine, to take a bribe, to extort a payment in return for an official act, to engage in money laundering, obstruction of justice, or misappropriation of national resources. In many countries, grand corruption, the abuse of public office by a nation's leaders, its highest official or officials, is long-standing and exists, not, as I said, because of a lack of laws, but because the corrupt leaders control the police, the prosecutors, and the courts. And they will not permit the honest, effective investigation, prosecution, and punishment of themselves, their families, and their friends. Therefore, because there are devastating consequences to this grand corruption, consequences are tremendous expense. Grand corruption breeds constituents for terrorists like Boko Haram and the Taliban. The countries characterized by the most corrupt leaders are also the most abusive of their citizens' human rights. And as Ukraine exemplifies, and as I discuss all over the world, indignation at grand corruption is now destabilizing many countries like Ukraine and causing grave dangers for international peace and security. For example, in 2014, indignation at grand corruption caused heroic Ukrainians, including my friend, Deputy Yegor Sobolev, to go to Maidan, to drive out Yanukovych to Russia. Russia invades Crimea. The United States and the EU have to respond, and that profoundly injures our ability to cooperate with Russia on matters that should be of mutual interest, like Syria and Iran. So grand corruption, it's rightly been said, is no longer just a domestic concern. It needs to be dealt with on the international level. The International Anti-Corruption Court, which III and now many others around the world advocate, would deal with this on what is called a principle of complementarity. If a country was willing and able to investigate, prosecute, and if crimes were proven, punish corrupt leaders, those leaders would not be vulnerable to prosecution in the International Anti-Corruption Court. But if a country, and Russia would be a prominent example, is unwilling or unable to investigate and prosecute a corrupt leader because that leader controls law enforcement in the courts, then that leader would be vulnerable to being prosecuted and punished in the International Anti-Corruption Court. There are now a growing number of individuals and NGOs and emerging countries who support the International Anti-Corruption Court. And it is now going, poised to go from being a concept that's become widely known around the world to becoming a coalition of individuals, organizations, and states that will launch a formal campaign to create the court next year. While the International Anti-Corruption Court was the initial motivating factor for forming III, our NGO, our mission, as I said, is now to strengthen the enforcement of criminal laws against corrupt leaders. And we do that in very meaningful measure by supporting national efforts to improve within a nation the enforcement of criminal laws, generally against corrupt officials, but particularly against high officials. And that's why I've been in Ukraine this week. I met Yegor Sobolev at an anti-corruption conference in Panama 2 years ago. He told me about Ukraine's then early initiative to create a special national anti-corruption court, which is necessary because it is widely perceived that your courts generally, your judges generally are corrupt and not capable, and therefore a special national anti-corruption court is urgently needed. This was not only Mr. Sobolev's view, it was the view of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Union, and indeed the United States, which were refusing to give Ukraine billions of dollars of much needed money that will benefit your country, unless and until Ukraine created a national anti-corruption court. As I understand it, and I'm confident this is correct though, the court didn't emerge simply because the international community is so interested in Ukraine and so determined to see the court. As I go around the world, I realize that Ukraine is distinguished. You may have a long history of pervasive corruption going to the top of your government, but you also have the great good fortune to have the most energetic, informed, and effective NGOs combating corruption that I've encountered anywhere in the world. You have really brave and impressive investigative journalists, and you have, although it may be a minority among your elected officials, people like Deputy Sobolev, who are determined to fight corruption from their political offices. So this unique combination of international attention and strong contending forces opposing corruption did in June lead to the enactment of legislation creating the National Anti-Corruption Court. As I expect everybody knows, it's not sufficient to have legislation. It's essential that it be honestly and effectively implemented. And that's largely, well, that's what brings me to Kiev this week. I was invited to share some of my experience and insights with the High Qualifications Commission, which will in the first instance select the candidates to be appointed to the Special Anti-Corruption Court, in the High Qualifications Council. Commission, excuse me. The High Qualifications Commission, where I met yesterday. And we had long discussions about what I believe to be the qualities of an excellent judge and the process of identifying and selecting excellent judges. I've been a judge for 33 years in the United States. I was appointed a judge because I had been a highly successful prosecutor of corrupt public officials in the United States. The United States is not distinguished because we have no corruption. Historically, it's been distinguished because we do something about it. And rather than punishing people who expose corruption, as happens in Russia, for example, with Alexei Navalny and Sergei Magnitsky, in my country, people who successfully oppose corruption, particularly high-level corruption, are often honored. And I was, in 1985, given the great honor of being appointed, nominated by the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, and approved by the United States Senate to be one of about 900 federal judges, United States judges, in my country. There's a very important feature of the legislation to create the National Anti-Corruption Court in Ukraine. At the insistence of the international donor community, the legislation provides for a panel of 6 international experts. Those experts won't be able to pick the judges for your court, but they will be able to veto, that is, stop the appointment of anybody that the panel, or actually 3 of the 6 members of the panel, find is not shown to be honest or not shown to be very competent, very capable. And the international donor community nominated a composite list of 12 candidates. 6 will be selected for the expert panel, and I'm pleased to say that III, the organization I chair, nominated originally 3 of the 12 candidates. I know each of them. They're intelligent, they're industrious, they're courageous, and they know an honest, excellent judge when they see one, and they know they would know a candidate who is not honest or very capable. So I expect that their participation in the process will minimize the risk that there will be judges appointed to this vital new anti-corruption court who are not both honest and excellent. When I met with the High Qualifications Commission, among others, I encouraged them in selecting the judges to not just select people who had been judges before, or people who had a lot of experience being judges before. But if you're creating a new court, I think it would benefit greatly from having a good number of distinguished lawyers, perhaps people who would never have had an opportunity to become a judge 10 or 20 years ago, when the system of selecting judges was unfair and perhaps dishonest based on nepotism or favoritism. There should be a good number of lawyers who've distinguished themselves. And frequently in the United States, it's lawyers who are appointed judges, as I was after being a prosecutor in 1985. I encouraged the appointment also of some excellent law professors, people of demonstrated intellect. And I particularly, whether they're judges or lawyers or law professors, encourage the appointment of relatively young people. It's very hard to change habits. If somebody's performed as a judge or even as a lawyer in a corrupt system, it's very hard to go and start behaving honestly. But if somebody is young and infected with the idealism of your revolution of dignity and goes to the court, they will get experience. But they, I hope and trust, will not lose the energy and the ideals that have caused the whole world to be focused on Ukraine now. The court, the National Anti-Corruption Court, is important for many reasons. First, its primary purpose is to assure that there'll be a place where corrupt officials can be held accountable if they violate the law. And that's essential in any democracy. Corruption is completely inconsistent with the rule of law in democracy. If corruption continues, well, in fact, yesterday, a representative of an NGO said to me, if this court doesn't work, if we don't get excellent judges and they don't perform properly, we're going back to Maidan. And I think that probably is in the forefront or the back of many minds. Corruption is just intolerable. It should be intolerable anywhere, but it's absolutely unacceptable in a democracy. When the Anti-Corruption Court is operating properly, it should be a model for the rest of your judiciary, because ultimately it's essential that every judge be honest and industrious, impartial and excellent. But it should be a model for selection and performance of judges. And because Ukraine is so important to the rest of the world, and really a laboratory for whether anything can be done to combat corruption and promote democracy and human rights, the court will determine how the world assesses Ukraine, and perhaps more importantly, the confidence that the people of your country have in their leaders. And that confidence is essential for any stable democracy and for any country that is going to attract international investment and realize the nation's economic potential, but also permit every individual to realize his or her human potential. So I came here to speak, and I have, but I also came here to learn. And I've learned a lot, and I've been actually inspired by people like Yegor Sobolev and people in the NGOs I've met, many people in the media that I've met, and I will go back to the United States with that inspiration and rededicated to being the honest and hopefully excellent judge I have the opportunity to be, and to continue to advocate for measures like the International Anti-Corruption Court and the National Anti-Corruption Court in Ukraine that will give other people the same opportunities that I have in the United States. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Yegor Sobolev, прошу.
Я би хотів зі свого
I would like, from my side, to underline a number of aspects that Judge Wolf didn't or hasn't mentioned because of his modesty. What's the main reason for his visit to Ukraine? Judge Wolf, with his personal example, is setting, a symbolic example of, and a very strong example of how an efficient law enforcement official, a judge, a member of the judiciary system, can bring about the conviction of a criminal implicated in corruption. And so for us, it's a good example, a strong example of how what we should do and how we should work in order to strengthen the rule of law in this country. And Judge Wolf, through all his activities, has been showing also the persistence of these efforts, that practically his example is the example of a never-ceasing fight. And so it's the second aspect, and it's been very important for us also. As an example, was Mr. Wolf's experience in helping Ukraine, assisting Ukraine in developing this anti-corruption legislation that brought about the establishment of the Anti-Corruption Court. Mark was one of the most ardent and supporters of the establishment of this court, and without his dedicated efforts, without his persistence and steadfast efforts, it would be very difficult for us to create this court. And what is also significant for us is not only that the court functions properly and puts the corrupt officials behind the bars, but also that this court would constitute, as Judge Wolf said, become a part of this great international idea of an international court, international level anti-corruption court. Because corruption is really international. You could take the cases of Mr. Firtash, of Mr. Manafort. You could see that many of these corrupt actions have been closely interconnected. Some of the cases have been related to the Russian oligarchs. And I think that corruption can be viewed to a certain extent as one of the linkages between Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs. And so as a Ukrainian rank-and-file citizen, I am not only interested in establishing the strong anti-corruption court in this country, but also assist the efforts, international efforts of aimed at establishing the international anti-corruption court. And the last thing I would like to mention is that I hope that the donors would support the idea of this international monitoring mission that would monitor the efforts of the government of Ukraine of the practical creation of this court. So Ukraine, as Judge Wolf mentioned, has become practically a laboratory of these experiments of struggle in the fight against corruption. And so if these efforts are successful, then we all could celebrate this success. Now the questions. Speaking about the candidates, we know that some of them have already had, reprimands, had been formally reprimanded before even they put forward their candidacies. So what's your view, what's your attitude towards such candidates, and what should be done about them?
I don't know the situation of any individual candidate. If a candidate has been reprimanded, disciplined for professional performance, I'm sure that the expert panel will examine that carefully and look at the reasons for the reprimand. In countries with corrupt judiciaries, sometimes it's honest judges who are disciplined, in my experience, not dishonest judges. So if I were on that expert panel, if I were on the High Qualifications Commission, I would certainly scrutinize with particular care any candidate who had been reprimanded, but also try to guard against the risk that the judge had been disciplined for being too honest or too independent or too impartial. But I think the expert panel will play a crucial role in this, and that should, as I said, minimize the risk that anybody who is not able to demonstrate that he or she is honest and not able to demonstrate that he or she is or will be a very good judge will not be allowed to be appointed.
Дякую вам за запитання. Я вважаю величезною проблемою не тільки те, що Лариса Гольник не була.
I not only think that Ms. Golnik's that barring Ms. Golnik from this procedure of selection was practically a a symbol of this corrupt system punishing practically a judge who wanted to break out of this vicious circle of corruption inside the judiciary system. She was sanctioned for that, punished for that. And the argument that they put forward was that she prosecuted some of the judges who were hearing the cases on the actions, violent actions sometimes in Maidan, and they used that as the main argument. Speaking about the candidates, or rather the composition of the Qualification Council, who are themselves simply appointed to their positions, they will have to sort out all this information, all the evidence, pro and contra, with regard to every candidacy. And when we put this idea of the anti-corruption court forward, we were saying at that time that with our corrupt political leadership and officials, it would be quite difficult to make this anti-corruption court selected properly and to get there, to put there the candidates that are unbiased and are not somebody's, proteges and political proteges and so on and so forth. One of the problems that we are hearing about now is that the Qualification Commission is of the opinion that the information about the candidates should not be divulged. They should not share it with anybody else.
Має бути подолана.
And in my view, this is another manipulation on their part, and I'm sure that they would, they would continue inventing these tricks more and more. But we can avail ourselves of the example of Judge Wolf, who showed that the corruption, corrupt officials, they have been very inventive all the time in struggling for their positions, protecting their positions. And we need to take all that into account. And it would be, I would be really amazed if people like President Poroshenko or the other officials would say that, I surrender. Where is the prison into which I should go? So we have already, and I, as a man who have already done a lot in order to make this law happen, to have this law enacted on the establishment of the anti-corruption court. I am against, any haste in this process, and I would like to draw the attention of the High Qualification Commission, with its chairman, Mr. Kosikov, that the responsibility for the proper selection process of the judges for the anti-corruption court is fully with them, and if they fail this work, it will be their responsibility 100%.
Several anti-corruption institutions that are already acting, but often people are asking, okay, and where is the result? We want someone to be prosecuted. And I would like to ask you, according to your experience, how many months or years we have to wait to say that the court or the institution that we have is efficient or is not efficient?
That's a hard question to answer, because investigating corrupt officials, they do everything they can to frustrate your investigation and slow it down. And then they complain that the investigation is taking too long. I'm not commenting on whether President Trump is honest or dishonest, but this is happening in the United States. Robert Mueller, who is in charge of investigating the allegations of illegal relationship of Donald Trump and people close to him with Russia, I hired in 1982. He's a highly professional prosecutor. I'm sure he's going as fast as he can, but it's hard to conduct an international investigation because if money is received illegally in Ukraine, it almost certainly didn't stay here. It's in Switzerland, it's in London, it's in New York City. Having said that, it's not an excuse for not doing energetic, tough investigations. Ukraine has a special anti-corruption investigative office, NABU. You have a special corruption prosecutor's office in SAPO, but a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If NABU is doing its job well, and if SAPO is doing its job well, and it still has to present its cases to corrupt or incompetent judges, those investigations and prosecutions will not be successful. So first, it's important to have the special investigators, NABU, the special prosecutors, SAPO, and to have the special anti-corruption court. Then it's important to keep attention on them, to make sure that they're performing efficiently and effectively. And as Mr. Sobolev said, there is now discussion in Ukraine and in the international community of setting up an informal body of international experts who will monitor the performance of the new anti-corruption court, who will advocate for that court if it's doing a good job, because if it's doing a good job, it will be criticized. And in the process, also monitor the performance of NABU and SAPO to see if they're developing and presenting corruption cases well. I think it's very important that the people of Ukraine and the people around the world who are so interested in what's happening in Ukraine now not lose their focus and careful attention after the court judges are appointed and the court begins functioning. Have to be always vigilant.
Я ще хочу додати до вашого запитання. Дуже важливо, щоб...
I would also like to add to your comments, my own comment, and say that you also, as the member of the media and so on, you should not feel yourself indifferent to our efforts, because it affects you as well. And if we involve people, or the people who are involved in this struggle against corruption, even they are, paid good salaries, they are public officials, government officials, but many of them are under strong pressure. You probably understand that. And in the course of this pressure, there are no guarantees that some of them would not, budge. And that's why Judge Wolf is here, to show his example, or personal example of this incessant fight, but the effective conduct of this fight, the successes reached in the course of that fight. So we need to invest in this fight, in this struggle every day. And if we want to have effective anti-corruption law enforcement bodies, investigative bodies, and judiciary bodies, and to root out the corruption in this country, I think we should acknowledge only too well that it's a long time, it's going to take a long time to root out this corruption, and we should not lower, so to say, our vigilance in this respect. If there are no more questions from the media representatives, please, you are welcome to ask, to make some final remarks in conclusion.
I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and through you to the people of Ukraine. It has really been a great and gratifying privilege to be here this week. I have dedicated my professional life to combating corruption in my own country and increasingly around the world. When I was a 28-year-old lawyer, I was an assistant to the Attorney General of the United States, our Minister of Justice, after Watergate, after the President of the United States resigned because of evidence, some of it secretly tape recorded in the Oval Office of his own criminal activity. And that was my early introduction to combating corruption and seeking to hold the highest officials accountable. And 5 years later, I was the chief federal public corruption prosecutor in Massachusetts, where corruption had been found to be a way of life. And after we won about 45 consecutive corruption cases, as I said earlier, I was given the high honor of becoming a United States district judge. 20 years ago today, I was concluding hearings in a case that you can read about today in the New York Times and elsewhere. I conducted 9 months of hearings, and people said it was taking too long, and then wrote a 661-page decision, and people said it was taking me too long to decide, but it turned out to be reportedly the longest decision in the history of the United States up to that time. And I was focused on what I found to be the corrupt relationship between the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, with its high echelon organized crime informants, its mafia informants, James Whitey Bulger and Stevie the Rifleman Flemmi. And I found that in return for information from the Bulger and Flemmi, the informants, and it later turned out in return for bribes from these informants, the FBI did not investigate these notorious alleged murderers, now proven murderers. It told them when other agencies were investigating them. It told them about wiretaps aimed at them. It told them, I found, of informers who were giving information and evidence about Bulger and Flemmi, who then died or disappeared. And they told Bulger that he was about to be charged in my case so he could flee, and he was a fugitive because they didn't look for him from 1995 to 2011. My findings were controversial and criticized, questioned until one of Bulger's associates was charged with 5 murders, and in a plea bargain, an agreement with the government, in an effort to get a lower sentence, took the FBI agents and still investigating to a grave in Boston where 3 of Bulger's victims were buried, and 2 of them were people I had written about. And then everybody knew that I was right. Took a long time. The FBI agent who was most responsible was sentenced to serve 10 years in prison for obstructing, trying to interfere with the hearings I was conducting, and then 40 more years in prison for his role in these murders. Bulger was finally caught in 2011. He was convicted of 11 murders. He was sentenced to what was essentially intended to be life in prison. He died 2 days ago at the age of 89. He was beaten to death in prison, apparently by members of La Cosa Nostra, the organization on which he had informed. And you can read about this in the Boston Globe or the New York Times right now. And this, 7 years ago, I sentenced the Speaker of our House of Representatives, the most powerful person in our Parliament, to 8 years in prison after conducting a 6-week trial where he was found guilty of demanding bribes in connection with $20 million worth of computer contracts. So this has largely been my professional life, but as I've gone around the world, I've seen that people in virtually all, good people in all countries, and certainly in Ukraine, have the aspirations that Americans have for honest government, where people seek office to serve the citizens, not to enrich themselves. And when I wrote my first two articles, published my first two articles advocating the International Anti-Corruption Court, they started and ended, each of them, talking about a young woman from Ukraine, Daria Kalinuk from Ant-AC, and how heroically she and others who had gone to Maidan were continuing the fight against corruption, and how they deserved the support of senior people like me and my colleagues in Integrity Initiatives International for their courageous efforts. And then I met Mr. Sobolev, and I became further inspired. So it's wonderful to have the opportunity. And in the United States, judges don't speak to the media, although they're all calling me now about the Whitey Bulger case. And I say, no, I still can't talk about that 20 years later. But to have a matter that I can, in my personal capacity as the chair of Integrity Initiatives International, speak about, to have so many intelligent, informed reporters express interest in this and ask excellent questions, to meet so many members of NGOs who are dedicated to fighting in this cause, which, as Yegor said, I believe was without conclusion. You can make progress. I was appointed a judge. The senior prosecutor in our office was elected governor of Massachusetts because people wanted good government, and that's what ultimately changes things. Not prosecutions, but the election of honest, able people. And I've had the opportunity to talk to officials who I believe would actually like to do a good job in selecting the judges. I believe they want to select good, honest judges. I don't know what pressures will be put up on them to do something else, but the fact that there are elected officials watching, the fact that the media is paying close attention, the fact that so many energetic and able NGOs are focused on this, and the fact that the international community is deeply interested, I hope will assure that you get the judges on your new anti-corruption court that the people of Ukraine deserve, and it becomes a model for all of your courts. And that when I come back here, and I very much look forward to coming back, you will be able to tell me about the progress, never the success, in my view, but the progress that's been made, because what all of us have tried so hard to do together, it would be very gratifying to make a small contribution to the major efforts being led by Mr. Sobolev, but by so many others too. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you for
Я
your
хочу
advice and
тільки
for being
додати,
with us
що
here today.
ви бачите, що найкращі люди світу готові нам допомагати, нам просто самі.
So as you can see, the best experts, the best people in the world are inspired and are inclined and willing to help us. So thank you, and let us all work in this area.